Okay, uh, welcome all. In today's class, I'll be looking at one of the essays by T.S. Eliot. It is entitled Hamlet and His Problems. This essay is a very controversial essay by Eliot. It is both famous at the same time, it is also has a notorious comment where Eliot labels Hamlet as one of the instances of artistic failures. And this statement generated much controversy and sometimes a misunderstood concept. But we need to focus on Eliot's ideas. We have to remember that Eliot is a modern critic. Okay. So obviously he wants to actually move away from the romantic mode of criticism or the subjective mode of criticism, which was at work in the field of critical theory at the time. So Eliot starts this essay by telling that few critics have been admitted that Hamlet the play is the primary problem and Hamlet the character only secondary. And Hamlet the character has had an special temptation for that most dangerous type of critic, the critic with a mind which is naturally of the creative order, but which through some weakness in creative power exercises itself in criticism indeed. These minds often find in Hamlet a vicarious existence for their own artistic realization. Such a mind had Goethe, who had made of Hamlet a Werther. You know that there was a text written by Goethe which was entitled The Sorrows of Young Werther. Okay. And such had Coleridge, who had made of Hamlet a Coleridge. And probably neither of these men, in writing about Hamlet, remembered that his first business was to study a work of art. The kind of criticism that Goethe and Coleridge produced in writing of Hamlet is the most misleading kind possible. For they both possessed unquestionable critical insight and both make their critical aberrations the more plausible by the substitution of their own Hamlet for Shakespeare's, which their creative gift effects. We should be thankful that Walter Pater didn't fix his attention on this play. So Eliot asserts here that the primary problem of Hamlet, the play, is actually with the character because he thinks that the character is a part of the play. Character is not someone who can be lifted out of the play. But unfortunately, according to T.S. Eliot, that this character of Hamlet has generated so much criticism, and even it invites a response to the imperfect critic. Now he mentions here as one of the most dangerous type of critic. If you read Eliot's other essay to criticize the critic, there Eliot distinguishes different kinds of critics. And now, at first here in the first paragraph of the essay, Hamlet and His Problems, he points out the limitations of the imperfect critic. Who is an imperfect critic? According to Eliot, an imperfect critic is one who finds an outlet for his creative impulses in criticism instead of being capable of expressing it wholly in creative art. So, an imperfect critique, according to Eliot, is guided by his subjective response. Okay, an imperfect critique does not fix his attention on the form of the text or on the real content of the text, where the text only matters, the personal biography, the characters which are lifted out of the text. Okay, it is not a matter of concern, but an imperfect critic is one who does this. Okay, so what happens in that case? When an imperfect critic comes and takes up analyzing the task of a play like Hamlet, in that case, the work of art is interpreted not objectively, but as per the likings or dislikings of that critic. And here Eliot categorically mentions two writers who wished to create a Hamlet and both of them failed. The first one is Getty, a German writer, and the second one is the British romantic poet Coleridge. So Eliot avers that in both cases, they actually fail to understand the real content of the play, and for them, the character of Hamlet became more important than the play. Getty, in Wilhelm Meister, describes Hamlet as a lovely, pure, and most moral nature who is bound to suffer intensely. And Eliot reacts to this type of criticism. It is not as it is not so what actually Getty had described as a lovely, pure, and noble. Okay. And another critic is Coleridge. Okay. And he thinks that Coleridge is also guided by this subjective mode of criticism because he had a touch of Hamlet in himself. So that's why ultimately at the end of this opening paragraph that he comes to the conclusion that it is good that Walter Pater didn't touch Hamlet because Walter Pater is an impressionistic critic. An impressionistic critic is basically a subjective critic, okay, who is more guided by his subjective response to a work of art. So that's why Eliot tells that we should be thankful that Walter Pater didn't fix his attention on this play. Later, in the second paragraph, Eliot mentions two critics who have done a bit of objective criticism, and that's why he actually extols them. These two writers are Robertson and Professor Stoll. So he tells two recent writers, Mr. J. M. Robertson and Professor Stoll of the University of Minnesota, have issued small books which can be praised for moving in the other direction. Mr. Stoll performs a service in recalling to our attention the labors of the critics of the 17th and 18th centuries, observing that they knew less about psychology than more recent Hamlet critics, but they were nearer in spirit to Shakespeare's art. And as they insisted on the importance of the effect of the whole rather than on the importance of leading character, they were nearer in their old-fashioned way to the secret of dramatic art in general. So, according to Eliot, that there are two small pamphlets published by J. M. Robertson and E. E. Stoll. And these two pamphlets are examples of objective criticism. The former book was the problem of Hamlet that was written by James Robertson. And Stoll also wrote a short pamphlet on the same play. And both of them made a reaction against the subjective mode of criticism prevalent at the time. And Stoll explains that Hamlet's delay is not occasioned by his kind of personal kind of dilemma, but it is a kind of prosaic fact. But had Hamlet directly actually went to take that revenge, there would have been no play at all. So it is a dramatic necessity. Just as you can remember that the porter's scene in Shakespeare's Macbeth was a sort of dramatic necessity, because Macbeth had to wash his hands. The character who is performing the role of Macbeth had to wash his hands before actually opening the gate. So that's why the porter's scene was inserted as a part of theatrical necessity. So these critics actually try to analyze the play from these angles. Okay, that this delay was a necessary one, because without this delay in taking up the revenge, there would have been no drama at all. So it is a delay device is actually a common stock of the Elizabethan dramas. Okay. And post-Coleridgean critics thought of the text of the play simply as the summary of the actions, and that the play existed only for the characters. But remember that Aristotle in Poetics had the opposite view. Did Aristotle say that character is more important in tragedy than plot? Actually not. Okay. Aristotle said that plot is the soul of tragedy. After that comes character. Character is important, but they cannot be compromised, okay, with the plot. So that's where these two critics, according to Eliot, have made a kind of considerable amount of authentic criticism. And then he tells in the third para that qua work of art, qua means as, okay, qua work of art, the work of art cannot be interpreted. There is nothing to interpret. We can only criticize it according to standards in comparison to other works of art. And for interpretation, the chief task is the presentation of relevant historical facts, which the reader is not assumed to know. Mr. Robertson points out very patently how critics have failed in their interpretation of Hamlet by ignoring what ought to be very obvious, that Hamlet is a stratification, that it represents the efforts of a series of men, each making what he could out of the work of his predecessors. The Hamlet of Shakespeare will appear to us very differently if, instead of treating the whole action of the play as due to Shakespeare's design, we perceive his Hamlet to be superposed upon much cruder material, which persists even in the final form. So Eliot makes here an important statement by telling that as a work of art, we cannot interpret it. And he affirms that in a work of art, there is nothing to interpret. Either you respond to it or you do not. And Eliot, I think, is here making actually the foundation for the comparative mode of criticism. Okay, because he tells that we can compare one work of art with the other works which were produced at the time. And this is what I think, to some extent, aligns with the idea of Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold also has opined in favor of a touchstone mode of criticism that also makes a comparative analysis of the different texts. So, as a kind of critique, you must have two tools: compare and contrast, and by virtue of which you can actually judge, estimate the real worth of a work of art. So the impressions received from a play are gradually enriched by association with impressions from other literature which are produced before and sometimes also after it. Okay, so there is no interpretation in the ordinary sense of the term, but only a reception of impressions, association with works produced by others, comparisons with them. And he tells that the day of the impressionistic critic is over. In the past, there were critics like Bradley, Raleigh. They were endowed with a sensitive, cultivated perception. Today, criticism is based not only on the critic's personal responses, but on the intellectual, dramatic, social, or religious conditions under which Shakespeare wrote. So the impressions of the critic must be relevant to this background. Otherwise, they are no longer considered significant. And since the information on Shakespeare's background is so large that modern critic usually specializes in some one aspect of it and brings that knowledge to bear upon Shakespeare. And in this case, he actually celebrates to some extent the criticism rendered by Robertson. Okay. And also he is told. The next paragraph, we know that there was an older play by Thomas Kidd, that extraordinary dramatic genius who was in all probability the author of two plays so dissimilar as the Spanish tragedy and the Arden of Feversham. And what this play was like we can guess from three clues. From Spanish tragedy, from the tale of Belforest upon which Kidd's Hamlet must have been based, and from a version acted in Germany in Shakespeare's lifetime, which bears strong evidence of having been adapted from earlier, not from the later play. And from these three sources, it is clear that in the earlier play, the motive was revenge motive, simply that the action or delay is caused, as in Spanish tragedy, solely by the difficulty of assassinating a monarch surrounded by guards, and that the madness of Hamlet was feigned in order to escape suspicion. So, here, Eliot makes and references to an Ur-Hamlet that was written by Thomas Kidd. Okay. And it is often told that Shakespeare modeled this play, Hamlet, on Thomas Kidd's play, that is Ur-Hamlet. But the problem is, the text of Ur-Hamlet is now not available. Okay. So it is actually said by some critics like Eliot that there was a play called Ur Hamlet. That was the original Hamlet. That was not written by Shakespeare, but by Thomas Kyd. Thomas Kyd, who actually was known for his Senecan tragedies. Okay. And these references of Ur Hamlet are found in the criticism of different writers, not only Eliot. If you read Lodge, if you read Nash's work, then this is also mentioned. Okay. And what Eliot tells here is that the earlier play, I mean, the play that was written by Thomas Kyd, was motivated by the kind of revenge kind of duty. Okay, it was almost a revenge play. But Shakespeare's Hamlet is not a revenge play. It is much more different from the mere revenge play. And in the original text, and he also mentions his other text, that is the Spanish tragedy. The Spanish tragedy is the story of a father avenging son after a long delay and madness. Okay, and these are the texts where the revenge motive was so strong. There are strong evidence. Okay, and Eliot also makes a reference to a German version, a version that was acted in Germany in Shakespeare's lifetime. Okay, so from all these inferences, we can come to the complicated nature of the text of Hamlet. And Eliot makes a good point when he suggests that the problem of Hamlet's character may actually be grounded in the problems of the text of the play. Okay. And there you can see, in the final play of Shakespeare, on the other hand, there is a motive which is more important than that of revenge, and which explicitly blunts the latter. That means the revenge motive is not clearly depicted, and the delay in revenge is unexplained on grounds of necessity or expediency. And the effect of the madness is not to lull, but to arouse the king's suspicion. In the original text, it was already depicted that Hamlet's madness is a feigned one. Hamlet is actually feigning madness in order to escape the suspicion of his uncle. Okay, but here you can see that in the case of Shakespeare's Hamlet, we cannot clearly tell that Hamlet is feigning madness. Okay, and though the other characters sometimes say that, yes, there is a method in madness, okay, but we cannot say certainly that he is pretending. He pretends to be mad. One minute. Yeah. So in the final play of Shakespeare, there is a motive which is more important than the revenge. And it is unexplained. So this alteration is not complete enough. There are verbal parallels so close to the Spanish tragedy as to leave no doubt that in places Shakespeare was merely revising the text of Kyd. And finally, there are unexplained scenes. So at first, Eliot accuses Shakespeare of having imitated or inserted some of the scenes which were already there, some of the verbal echoes of Thomas Kyd's Spanish tragedy. He had interpolated some of the speeches from Thomas Kyd's Spanish tragedy. And then he tells that Hamlet had that Shakespeare had added in Hamlet some extraneous scenes which are not explained properly. Finally, there are unexplained scenes, the Polonius Laertes and the Polonius Rinaldo scenes, for which there is little excuse. These scenes are not in the verse style of Kyd, and not beyond doubt in the style of Shakespeare. This Mr. Robertson believes to be scenes in the original play of Kyd, reworked by a third hand, perhaps Chapman, before Shakespeare touched the play. So Eliot thinks that George Chapman perhaps collaborated with Thomas Kyd while producing the text, and which Shakespeare had read from where he had taken his material, but he couldn't actually produce an organic whole. That he will come to the conclusion later. And he concludes with a very strong show of reason that the original play of Kyd was like certain other revenge plays in two parts of 5 acts each. The upshot of Mr. Robertson's examination is, we believe, irrefragable. That cannot be refuted. Okay. যেটাকে আমরা ভুল প্রমাণ করতে পারি না. So that Shakespeare's Hamlet, so far as it is Shakespeare's, is a play dealing with the effect of a mother's guilt upon her son, and that Shakespeare was unable to impose this motive successfully upon the intractable material of the old play. So there we find that what Eliot thinks of this play, after having kind of said many things about the flaws of Shakespearean Hamlet, and what he thinks to be the real problem of Hamlet. So according to Eliot, the real problem of Hamlet is the effect of a mother's guilt upon her son. This is what Eliot believes. And Eliot believes that this aspect is not depicted clearly or in an extended way by Shakespeare. Okay. And Shakespeare had inherited materials from many sources. The revenge motif is perhaps taken from Spanish tragedy. Okay. Some materials which were written by Chapman. Okay. And to this, Shakespeare added a new motive, but that is insufficiently articulated. And for all this, there is absolutely no documentary evidence. Robertson, on the basis of his subjective feelings, assigns different passages of the play to different hands. And he tells that Ur Hamlet, that was written by Thomas Kyd, consisted of 2 parts, each running to 5 acts. So after having depicted the shortcomings of Shakespeare's Hamlet, where Eliot believes that Shakespeare failed to articulate the relationship, the kind of the guilt shame complex between the son and the mother. So I think perhaps Eliot, this is my own personal opinion of the text, is actually thinking or making a comparison between Hamlet and Sophocles' Oedipus Rex or Oedipus the King, where this aspect was one of the prominent issues, the effect of mother's guilt upon her son. Okay. But here, I don't think that this is the central theme of Shakespeare's Hamlet, or Hamlet, the text, which was available that time. But Eliot tells categorically that it is a play dealing with the effect of a mother's guilt upon her son. Now, This is the most important passage, and this essay is famous basically for this passage or this sentence. Of the intractability, there can be no doubt. Next sentence is the most important of this essay. So far from being Shakespeare's masterpiece, the play is most certainly an artistic failure. In several ways, the play is puzzling and disquieting, as is none of the others. Of all the plays, it is the longest and is possibly the one on which Shakespeare spent most pains. And yet he has left in it superfluous and inconsistent scenes which even hasty revision should have noticed. The versification is variable. So ultimately, Eliot, the critic, affirms that it is an artistic failure. It is not successful in terms of the aesthetics of a work of art. It is the longest play of Shakespeare. Shakespeare took much time to actually finish it, but couldn't actually give it the proper finesse. The versification is variable, like some examples that he has given. Look, the morn in russet mantle clad walks over the dew of yon high esteemed hill. And there are of Shakespeare's of Romeo and Juliet, these lines from Act 5, Scene 2. But I'm skipping that. Are of his quite mature. Okay, so he gives some passages from other texts to depict that the versification is mature one, as the passage that he had quoted from Romeo and Juliet. Both workmanship and thought are in an unstable condition. We are surely justified in attributing the play with other profoundly interesting play of intractable material and astounding versification, measure for measure, to a period of crisis after which follow the tragic success which culminate in Coriolanus. Coriolanus may not be as interesting as Hamlet, but it is, with Antony and Cleopatra, Shakespeare's most assured artistic success. And probably more people have thought Hamlet a work of art because they found it interesting, than have found it interesting because it is a work of art. It is the Mona Lisa of literature. So now he gives instances of artistic success, and he mentions two plays of Shakespeare which can be called as artistically success. One is Coriolanus and the other is Antony and Cleopatra. But he thinks that in the case of Hamlet, it is completely an artistic failure. Artistic failure because remember that Eliot always thinks of the form as one of the harbingers of the new critique. Okay, because when Eliot was writing, the new criticism actually didn't originate. They actually didn't originate. But he can be called as one of the pioneers of the new criticism in England. Okay. Eliot, along with I.A. Richards. I.A. Richards, in his The Principles of Psychology, actually. So there he also talks about the same thing. Okay, if you read the text of I.A. Richards, there he also categorically mentions about the loopholes of subjective or the personal kind of criticism. And if you read his text, okay, the practical criticism, actually, in practical criticism, he actually talks about this, which is the study of the literary judgment. Okay. And Eliot is also actually making the foundation for this new mode of criticism to appear later, where we cannot take the characters out of the play. For example, if you read A.C. Bradley's Shakespearean Criticism, Shakespearean Tragedy, it is entitled, a very famous book, where he actually analyzes four key tragedies of Shakespeare. But A.C. Bradley actually considered the characters more important than the play. To him, Macbeth the man appealed to him. To him, Hamlet the man, Othello the man, or King Lear the man appealed to him. And it is actually, he is romanticizing these characters in the play. Okay, romanticizing and not discussing the artistic aspects of the entire work of art. They are eliminated. Okay, and this is something that he categorically mentions here. And now comes his most important theory. And he tells that by adding the dramatic passages from the other texts where Shakespeare has excelled, where we can see the triumph of his artistic success. And then he calls it a kind of very mysterious text, Mona Lisa, okay, obscure, which cannot be properly understood. That what Shakespeare has tried to depict here. The grounds of Hamlet's failure are not immediately obvious. Mr. Robertson is undoubtedly correct in concluding that the essential emotion of the play is the feeling of a son towards a guilty mother. Again, he tells this. Hamlet's tone is that of one who has suffered tortures on the score of his mother's degradation. This is a quotation that he extracts from Robertson's work. The guilt of a mother is an almost intolerable motive for drama, but it had to be maintained and emphasized to supply a psychological solution, or rather a hint of one. This is by no means the whole story. It is not merely the guilt of a mother that cannot be handled as Shakespeare handled the suspicion of Othello, the infatuation of Antony, pride of Coriolanus. The subject might conceivably have expanded into a tragedy like this, intelligible, self-complete in the sunlight. So there, Eliot holds that nothing prevented Shakespeare from handling this mother guilt motive as he had expanded other motives in the other tragedies. In the case of Othello, he has expanded the motive of jealousy. In the case of Antony and Cleopatra, he has expanded the motive of lust. In the case of Coriolanus, he has expanded the motive of arrogance. And it is apparent from this lack of motivation in Hamlet that there Shakespeare was dealing with something that he could not expose. At the core of this art, there must be something that is perfectly intelligible, and that is what is lacking in this play. And when we search for this feeling, we find it, as in the sonnets, very difficult to localize. You cannot point to it, the speeches. Indeed, if you examine the two famous soliloquies, you see the versification of Shakespeare, but a content which might be claimed by another, perhaps by the author of Revenge of Vasidium Boys, Act 5, Scene 1, where we find Shakespeare's Hamlet not in the action, not in any quotations that we might select, so much as in an unmistakable tone, which is unmistakably not in the earlier play. So I think Eliot is mistaken here. Eliot is completely mistaken here in saying that though the versification of the two famous soliloquies is that of Shakespeare, the content might have been borrowed from Chapman. And this text, Revenge of Bassett Amboise, is written by Chapman. Okay, and in that text, we have the Duke of Guise talking of human life in general in a situation of impending revenge. And these are the only things in common with the situation of Hamlet. But to argue on this flimsy basis that Hamlet's speeches were directly borrowed from Chapman's Revenge of Bassett Amboise, where he is also facing a sort of existential crisis, that is an absurd thinking on the part of Eliot. Okay. And then he actually depicts his theory, actually, for which this is famous. The only way of expressing emotion in the form of art is by finding an objective correlative. Focus on the spelling of this word. It is not correlative, C-O-R-R. Okay. Objective correlative. In other words, what is it? What is objective correlative? That is a set of objects, situation, chain of events which shall be formula of that particular emotion, such that when the external facts which must terminate in sensory experience are given, the emotion is immediately evoked. Actually, Eliot wanted to express this term, much influenced from the French criticism, his term of objective correlative. That's why he actually talked so many things about Hamlet. So though he calls others as imperfect critics who are guided by some personal prejudice, he thinks that the romantic critics are guided by a kind of philosophical kind of ideas, okay, subjective responses. But he also does this to some extent. Okay, to some extent, he is also a victim of this. His criticism also suffers from a dogmatic mode of criticism. What is objective correlative? That means, to put it very simply, this is almost the fag end of that essay, or the most important part of that essay. Herefrom, you can expect question. Okay. Objective correlative is the only topic that is important, but it can come actually from different angles. That is his own theory, own artistic theory. Objective correlative means, to put it very simply, that you cannot express an emotion directly. And in some other cases, Eliot has opined that as a modern poet, you cannot express emotions directly. This is what he believes as a modern poet. Modern mind is complex. Modern life is complex. That requires a different bit of presentation. Okay. And now he tells that the only way of expressing emotion is not given actually a direct outlet to the inner feelings, but a kind of some motifs, some typical images which will be recurrent to one and that will correspond with the mood of the poem or mood of that drama or any other literary text. Think of his own kind of project in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, where he had done this objective correlative, because Prufrock is Eliot's Hamlet. Okay. And he has written this at the kind of last or the penultimate stanza. I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. Okay. But there, the second stanza of the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, where we are given a description of that scene where Prufrock is actually located in a house and he is describing the fog outside. The brown fog that is given the feline or the cat-like attributes. Okay. And the foggy atmosphere outside. The second stanza has got nothing to do with, apparently nothing to do with what actually Prufrock is thinking or his conscience, his kind of inner mood. But that foggy weather corresponds to, in a sort of objective correlative, the inner mind of Prufrock. Prufrock is also a man divided against himself. He's a self-divided person, isn't it? So that foggy weather, which Eliot graphically sketches, corresponds. That is a kind of objective correlative. Okay, so that's how the emotion need to be presented, not directly, but in the case of Hamlet, it happens. Hamlet vehemently gives expression to his feelings, moods, which should not have been done. Actually. Though Hamlet suffers from a mental kind of trauma, the kind of relationship, the guilt, shame complex that pervades the entire play shouldn't have been depicted in such type of direct manner, but by finding some correspondence that can depict that what is going through the mind of the characters. And that's why he calls the example from another text. I am just talking it in paraphrase. The last part is not so important because the crux is already given here. And then he gives examples from Shakespeare's Macbeth. And he gives the instances of the sleepwalking scene, the famous sleepwalking scene, Act 5, Scene 1. And Eliot cites the sleepwalking scene where Shakespeare doesn't need to tell us that what Lady Macbeth is feeling. On the other hand, he gives us a set of sensory perception, candle, perfumes of Arabia, smells of blood, and we at once get a clear picture of her emotional and mental state. That is the proper way. Had Shakespeare devised a similar type of pattern? Okay, not exactly sleepwalking scene, but some scene actually that corresponds to that kind of bitter outflow of that anguished mind. It would have been kind of put in a better way. But I think that Eliot is wrong here, because if you read Hamlet, Hamlet is not an artistic failure. Many critics have opined it. Okay, and it is from Hamlet that psychological branch of criticism has also got many kind of inputs. And there is a famous scene in Hamlet, that is the grave digger scene, Act 5, Scene 1. The grave digger scene, I think, is a brilliant execution on the part of Shakespeare to depict the bitter outflow of the anguished mind of Hamlet, where he is ruminating over the tragedy of man when he confronts Yorick, the jester. So what is going through the mind of Hamlet can be gauged here. So Shakespeare actually tried, remember. Perhaps Eliot had read Hamlet long time ago when he wrote this essay. This is not what I am talking, but many critics have actually said this, that he may have written this essay long time after he has actually read Hamlet, the text. But Eliot tells that Hamlet is dominated by an emotion that is inexpressible because it is in excess of facts that they appear. So this is not actually a kind of proper idea actually to call Hamlet an instances of artistic failure. Okay, this is not what we can actually second or what we can accept. And this essay, I don't think, is a product of mature criticism of T.S. Eliot. It has many loopholes, but notwithstanding this, what counts is this notion of objective correlative. This essay is only important for this term, the objective correlative. Yes. So, as a modern critic, this term has some points. This term has got some important inputs. Okay, where we can find that what he is trying to mean by objective correlative. Okay, so you have to actually craft your work of art in such a manner that will correspond to the moods of the character. Okay, that should be your goal, not the direct representation of the mind of the character. Perhaps another instance I can give, which Eliot could have given, that is from King Lear, where the storm scene of Lear, storms, there are storm scenes actually in Act 3. Different scenes are there. Act 3 is into 4. So the storm scenes of King Lear are some of the instances where the internal storm that is actually going through the mind of Lear is given an external kind of output, or as a, or in Eliotian phrase, the objective correlative. Okay, so the storm scene actually is the kernel of King Lear, where the old Lear dies and a new Lear is born. The new Lear, who is not egocentric, the Lear who is actually out from that sort of prejudices. But as per T.S. Eliot, as he tells here, and after that, the last paragraph that is there, that is not so important, where he tells this, or the conclusion: the madness of Hamlet lay to Shakespeare's hand, and in the earlier play a simple ruse, and to that end we may presume understood as a ruse by the audience. For Shakespeare, it is less than madness and more than feint. The levity of Hamlet, his repetition of phrase, his puns are not part of a deliberate plan of dissimulation, but a form of emotional relief. In the character Hamlet, it is the buffoonery of an emotion which can find no outlet in action. In the dramatist, it is the buffoonery of an emotion which he cannot express in art. So obviously that he uh, makes this point that the levity of Hamlet, his puns, the repetitions symbolize a breakdown of language, which is inevitable in such a situation. Words lose their meaning and have to be used unnaturally to fit in with an unnatural situation. And I think that it is not certainly a process of emotional relief as Eliot suggests. Even when he is most clownish, Hamlet is emotionally most tense, as in the scene where he kills Polonius. So Eliot should have noticed the resemblances between Hamlet and the fool in Lear, and also the function served by the potter in Macbeth. In none of these cases does any question of emotional relief arise. Okay, so I'll stop here, and if you have any question, you can ask.
Sir, do